Good afternoon and welcome to today's event, preparing for the next wave of UN peace operations transitions. I'm Jake Sherman, Director of IPI's Brian Urquhart Center for Peace Operations. 5 years ago, the United Nations maintained 16 peacekeeping missions around the world, with over 127,000 authorized uniformed personnel, more than 22,000 civilians, and a budget of nearly $8 billion. Since then, peacekeeping has entered a period of consolidation. With the closure of missions in Cote d'Ivoire and Liberia, and next month Haiti, there will be 13, with 25% fewer authorized troops than in 2014. This is largely a story of success, the achievement of relative stability and peaceful democratic transitions of power in those three countries through the long-term engagement of UN peacekeeping missions and the sustained interest of the Security Council and the wider international community. By contrast, the next wave of peacekeeping transitions are almost certain to prove more complex and challenging, with unfinished political settlements, ongoing protection challenges, huge geographic territories with limited state presence, and often weak host state consent for a strong follow-on political or human rights role for the UN. Future transitions will also take place in a climate of decreasing consensus in the Security Council, pressure for the UN to do more with less, and increased scrutiny around the effectiveness of UN peacekeeping. Over the past 2 years, with the generous support of the government of Germany, IPI has conducted research on peace operations transitions with the aim of identifying forward-looking lessons for the UN and member states on how to better manage these complex processes, whether ongoing drawdowns, as in Darfur, missions devising exit strategies, as in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or those in the early stages of planning future transitions. Today's policy forum draws on insights from IPI's project, as well as UN and Security Council experts, to examine the political and policy dynamics challenges confronting peacekeeping transitions, recent and ongoing efforts to manage these processes, and reflections how to better ensure that when a mission leaves, it leaves behind the conditions for sustainable peace. With that, I'm going to turn over the floor to my colleague, Daniel Forti, who's going to introduce the panel and moderate. Daniel?
Thanks, Jake. Good afternoon. Welcome to IPI, and thank you all for joining us today. UN peace operations are going through a renewed period of drawdown and reconfiguration. Between June 2017 and March 2018, long-standing peacekeeping missions in Cote d'Ivoire and Liberia closed, while the mission in Haiti reconfigured to focus on justice and policing, and more recently reconfigured into a special political mission. As Jake mentioned, the UN Security Council has mandated the closure of the mission in Darfur, the initial drawdown of the peacebuilding mission in Guinea-Bissau, and is now turning its attention to early planning for the eventual transition of other multidimensional peace operations. At their core, transitions are about reconfiguring how the UN engages with national actors on the country's peacebuilding, development, and security priorities. Transitions don't just begin when the UN Security Council sets a final withdrawal deadline, nor do they conclude when the last peacekeeper leaves the country. Instead, transitions are multi-year processes that require sustained engagement. In this light, transitions are one of the few processes that bring together the entire UN system, with its peace and security, development, and human rights arms all playing important roles. Today's panel will reflect on the current dynamics and practice of transitions, and ultimately what the UN and its member states are doing to better improve these complex undertakings. Before turning to the colleagues beside me, I want to briefly summarize some of the insights into IPI's research. The 4 publications, 3 case studies on the UNMIL, UNOSI, and MINUSTA, produced by excellent IPI colleagues, cover many of these issues in extensive detail, but they broadly focus on the following: Security Council politics and the role of benchmarked exit strategies, the integration, coordination, and planning of transitions from both the headquarters and the field perspective, how the UN can reconfigure its support to peacebuilding priorities during and after transitions, engagements with national actors and international partners during transitions, and dynamics related to mission support, logistics, and financing. In response to these issues, our most recent publication, which is a consolidated issue brief, offers 6 overarching recommendations, very briefly summarized as follows. First, the Security Council should incorporate shared and long-term political strategies for transitions into peacekeeping mandates. These should be forward-looking and define how the UN should sustain its political engagement with national actors on mandated peacekeeping tasks and long-term peacebuilding priorities. Council members should think of transitions in terms of end states, the conditions that it wants to leave behind following a UN reconfiguration, rather than end dates. Second, transition should be spearheaded by a field-level planning strategy, where mission leadership, backed by dedicated capacity and resources, should help shape the overarching substantive vision and drive the transition process. Detailed transition plans should reflect national peacebuilding priorities and align with existing development frameworks, incorporate capacity assessments of national and international actors, demonstrate opportunities for joint programming, and factor in risk assessments and scenario-based contingencies. Third, the UN should emphasize strategic communications with host communities during transitions. Our research highlighted that peacekeeping missions and UN agencies, funds, and programs are often synonymous to the communities that engage with them most frequently. The closure of field presences outside of capitals not only reduces the services and support provided to these communities, but also contribute to the incorrect perception that the UN has left the country entirely. We encourage joint mission and country team communication plans, the handover of UN communications infrastructure to national or regional partners, and symbolic ceremonies that mark the UN's reconfiguration. Fourth, we urge the host government, member states, and the UN to engage early in order to secure adequate financing for transitions, even before the Security Council sets a final withdrawal deadline. These approaches require both improved financing strategies and greater coordination amongst development partners. These efforts can take a range of forms, whether pooled funding mechanisms or assessed contributions from UN peacekeeping budgets directed towards joint peacebuilding programs, as is the case with UNAMID and the State Liaison Function Project. Fifth, the UN can sustain long-term peacebuilding engagements through strengthened partnerships. Once a shared understanding on peacebuilding priorities is in place, the UN system should ensure that these are reflected across consistent and predictable working relationships with national institutions and actors. Neighboring countries and other multilateral institutions, including regional organizations and international financial institutions, can provide complementary political, programmatic, and financial support to accompany the UN's reconfigured presence. At the UN, the Peacebuilding Commission and informal groups of friends have demonstrated value in sustaining attention on transitions. Sixth, and finally, the research emphasized the importance of the UN strengthening its dedicated capacities for transition-related support. Such expertise, including those deployed to the UN field presences or others prepared to serve as surge capacity, can provide guidance on policy and programmatic issues, help colleagues in missions and country teams with their long-term strategic planning, support leadership in engaging on change management issues, and expedite operational tasks like liquidation. So with these brief reflections, I'd now like to turn to our excellent panelists. First, I'll start on my right. I'd like to turn to Ms. Rania Dagash, Chief of Policy and Best Practice Services in the UN Department of Peace Operations Division of Policy, Evaluation, and Training, who will share some insights on recent UN transition experiences and highlight the work of the UN Joint Transitions Project. Rania, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I'll start by thanking IPI, as we usually do, for bringing us together to have very animated, heated, and very useful discussions. So I look forward to one today. I'm going to run you through 3 components of transitions, and I'll try and do all of that in 7 minutes. The first part, and that's 7 points, about what are the key strategic issues that we've observed in transition so far. And the second part will go a little bit into the key lessons learned that we've had of the different UN transitions, and then a little bit about our joint transition project, what it's been doing and what we would like it to do in the future. So, what are the big issues that we've seen? I think the first one is transitions are fundamentally political processes. That's the start and the end. And we often deal with them as technical processes. And I think it's important that we remember this point. They're complex. They come at difficult times of risk and uncertainty for countries and for the United Nations. So we've certainly observed that there's a need for the UN leadership, as well as the host countries, to have a strong understanding of what it is that we're dealing with here. There's a substantive component of the elements we're dealing with, the political elements, the governance elements, the security sector elements, but there are also organizational elements, and there are also human aspects of a transition. Not only with the host countries where we are working, but also with our own staff as a United Nations team that's been there a very long time. So learning and observing that is one chunk was certainly a very big learning curve for us. The second point is that proactive and integrated transition planning is absolutely vital for this to succeed. I think there's generally a need for continued targeted support in various areas, and we have said this and we have learned this, and we are now finally starting to practice it, that we have a joint analysis and understanding of the context when we are in transition, when the UN is transitioning out of a country. And a lot of work has certainly been done on this. There's the SG Directive on Transition Planning that was issued in February 2019, and we aim to make this a much more integrated process in how we do business. But it was a big point and learning for us. The third point is about sustaining political engagement. Now, we said it's a political process, right? A transition is a political process. But sustaining that political engagement, we've certainly observed has been challenging, not only during the transition, but more critically after the transition of a UN operation. And a withdrawal of a large mission specifically, because we often leave behind a UN country team presence which was there before us and remains there after a mission has withdrawn or closed. So sustaining that is absolutely critical and often a problem that we have dealt with. The resident coordinator in Liberia recently was here, and his message was consistently, the mission closed and you left me on my own. No one talks of Liberia, no one addresses our vulnerabilities, no one follows up with us on a lot of these issues. And I think the message has been taken to heart by many, and he echoes a long row of RCs who have definitely said the same. The fourth point is about safeguarding a space for peace building, even as the Security Council engages, and the UN leverage decreases. And what that again requires and loops us back to is the fourth point about political strategies being designed so that the buy-in of all stakeholders across the organization and beyond is done well from the very beginning, and that we safeguard whatever peace-building priorities we're able to work with a country on beyond the transition and exit of a large peacekeeping operation or a special political mission. The fifth point is the financial cliff that was just referred to. After a mission withdraws, it's a significant risk for a host country pathway because sustainable development and economic stability require a lot of resources. But we leave and a lot of the money leaves with us. And we've certainly learned that that's a big strategic issue that has to be grappled with. You've mentioned it for Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, and it continues to be a big concern for upcoming missions that are exiting Darfur specifically. Now, the sixth point is linked to this as well, and it's linked to our resources. It's just the lack of resources or insufficient funding that we find for peacebuilding activities, and how we come together as a system that is able to galvanize and use that to prioritize and not only talk the talk, but actually walk the walk and be able to sustain and support those medium-term and long-term peacebuilding priorities with our host nations. And then the last one, and I deliberately put this as the last point, though it is probably the most important point, is about national leadership and ownership. It's a big ticket issue, it's a big strategic issue, and we have certainly learned that if it isn't integrated and discussed and agreed with a host nation, then it becomes a very false exercise that really doesn't bring us together, nor does it help the country, nor does it help the United Nations, nor the legacy of the United Nations, or those that we were there to help to begin with. So it's a very important aspect, and I think we have learned a lot in the last few years, and we have dealt with it very differently. When we launched the legacy report of UNOSI to Cote d'Ivoire, closed in 2017, it was hosted by the Ivorian mission here. And that was a proud moment, I think, for peacekeeping, that we have come together to the point where Ivory Coast hosts the legacy report and talks through what was learned from having a peacekeeping mission. And we intend to do the same with Liberia, because we're finalizing a legacy report on UNMIL as well. I would argue that Liberia also gave us, under this point, a very successful story where defining the peacebuilding priorities were worked on before the mission closed and continued to direct the work of the United Nations in the country after the mission closed, building on the priorities of the government. I would argue Sierra Leone did the same, 2012 too. So we've learned over the years. The three big learnings that we've done against those 7 points, more strategically, I would say, is we face a double cliff. The first point is we face a double cliff in transitions. We close, as I said, in a moment where international interest is waning and donors have reached a point of fatigue. And that combination means that there is a very sharp financial cliff that occurs after serious conflict and a time when we need that support. Liberia received $10 billion in bilateral aid during the tenure of UNMIL, $10 billion. And UNMIL assessed contributions totaled roughly $7.5 billion for the time it was there. That's $17.5 billion. And we left in 2018, and there was very little to compare to the amounts of money that we're referring to now. We certainly face a concern with UNAMID because we've put $700 billion into Darfur, and it's unclear what happens when and if the mission closes. There's still discussions about what would go in to bridge that, but it still won't compare to where we are. The second point on what we've learned would be elections. Elections are a key point in a transition, both for the country, of course, and for the UN. And we've learned that it's an extremely catalytic point in terms of political engagement for the UN, but it's also a natural transition point. It's a moment where we recognize a new phase in a country and the end to the threat to peace and security for most part. But they still pose a direct challenge to mission transitions, and it shouldn't be considered a default benchmark. And I'll try not to look at my German colleague in the council when I say this. But I think it needs more careful analysis before we say elections are the benchmark after which a mission needs to exit. what we've observed is that newly elected governments often don't buy into whatever transition plan has been negotiated or agreed before and are unable to implement it, leaving us both in limbo for quite some time. Third point, are my 7 minutes over? Almost? Okay. The third point is the risk of relapse. And it's something we don't talk about often in transitions, but it's an important point when we are devising policy and practice, because we mainly rely on the success stories. Liberia was successful, Cote d'Ivoire was successful, Timor was successful, Sierra Leone was successful. And a lot of our practice is based on that. But I think it's important to bear in mind when we're designing moving forward that the risk of relapse into conflict is a real threat in some of the countries. And provided we have a full understanding of that and know what to do thereafter, we're able to design and plan our transition better. And that will rely on independent and risk-driven assessments, not those that we do ourselves, because they're somewhat biased, one would argue. My final point is about the transition project, which has been carrying a lot of what the UN work on transitions has been doing. And with the support of the Swedish government, this project was set up in 2014. It goes in and helps us do these lessons learned we refer to. It helps us finance the transition experts that we deploy to bring the agencies and the mission in the country, the host country, together. And it's ending in April 2020. We're pitching a new transitions project. It's a project that hosts UNDP, DPO, DPA, and will soon include DCO also as the new custodians of resident coordinators. And our aim is to make sustaining political engagement a critical component of this project, support for proactive and integrated planning, transition financing and resource mobilization, and also operationalizing national ownership and working with host countries through a transition process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rania. I think the two key words I took away from your presentation first are complexity and then sustainability, which we all need to work together to find answers to. I'd now like to turn to Ms. Taya Kontanin-Sharp, Chief of Staff at the UN Development Coordination Office, to reflect on transitions from the perspective of the UNDS.
Thank you. Well, first of all, it's really a pleasure to be here. So thank you for the invite. Thank you to IPI. And it's really great to see so many familiar faces in the audience. I think we've been talking about transitions for many years now. So I'm glad to see that we continue on this journey together. Before I talk a little bit more about the UN development system and how the kind of transition file, what that looks for us, what that looks like for us in this new kind of day and age, I wanted to actually just recall something. When I was preparing for this and thinking what are the key points that I would want to kind of bring to the discussion, I started off by just recalling that actually, you know, when the current Secretary General came in, one of the first things that he did was start up something called the Executive Committee, which is essentially his cabinet-style decision-making body. Those of us who are UN bureaucrats know this body very well because we in one way or another interact with it on a weekly basis. But interestingly, one of the first items that he actually put on the agenda in January 2017 was on transitions. And I think that is really, I mean, I obviously can't speak for him, but it's kind of fair to say that there's a recognition kind of from that initial engagement already of how important it is to work more effectively across these different pillars to make sure that we can really improve and demonstrate the UN's value and our offer in these contexts. And of course, since then, there's been a lot of work under this new Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General on transition. Specifically, Rania mentioned the Secretary General's planning directive, all of the work around that, but then also really looking, for example, through the Action for Peacekeeping initiative that lifts transitions as one of its core components, all the way then to the way that we're working on the UN development system. reform at the moment to kind of also find better coherence. So I thought that that was quite a good starting point to just remember that actually this really has been at the forefront of the agenda now for a few years. So you know, we need to start acting and moving forward. So what's changed now, and how are we from the development system side thinking of transitions and driving change in these contexts? I think the first big change, and this is not even so much the development system reform per se, is really around the sustainable development goals. And Rania actually mentioned it already, which is this idea that the centrality of actually putting the government at the very core, or the host government at the very core of what we do in terms of supporting peace and development and sustaining peace. And the universality of the SDGs really gives us an anchor. And for the first time also, I think, gives the missions in some ways an anchor to become an input to a kind of broader support conversation on peace and development in a specific country. So, for example, this is not about mixing mandates between ECOSOC or the Security Council, or mixing mandates of what the development system needs to do versus what the peace and security system does. But it's really about looking at how do we sustain, peace in contexts such as, say, Haiti, where a lot of the interventions that the mission might be doing are actually programmatic in nature. So we're talking about rule of law, or we're talking about gender, or we're talking about issues that really at the heart of it are actually sustainable development issues, and issues where we have to jointly plan and be able to vision a trajectory in support of the government that goes beyond the mission's time frame in a country. And the other point that I would really want to make is that we at the UN quite often think of mission drawdown and closure as the closure of the UN in a country. As for the country team was there before, and the country team will be there after. And I think one of the biggest shifts really in the last couple of years that I've been working on this file has been that there's this recognition that we're not talking about a new phase per se. We're talking a different kind of configuration in a country when a transition happens. So we're transitioning essentially to a different kind of UN support for the country. And I think that's really important. The second point I wanted to bring to the table today is really talking about moving from transition planning and a handover of tasks or a handover of issues to the country team or to the government, to really thinking of how we plan jointly from day one. So a very good example at the moment is actually the work that the UN is doing in the context of Haiti and the new mission that's being set up there, where the country team and the mission, the DSRSG, the SRSG, and also kind of the principles around these different entities are really working together from day one, from the beginning of that mission, to look at where do we want to land, and what does that transition actually look like in the context of also the development agenda. And for us, one of the core deliverables in this context and the UN development system reform is really the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework. And that's quite a mouthful, so we'll call it the Cooperation Framework. Used to be called the UNDAF, for those of you who know UN planning a little bit more. And the Cooperation Framework is really the anchor for the development system of everything that we do at a country level. So it essentially contains two components. The first one is an analysis of the development challenges in a given country as the UN sees it, and that's called the Common Country Analysis. And the interesting thing to me, having worked many years in kind of planning and on both the humanitarian development and peace and security side, is that we've spoken so many years about needing to do joint analysis better, and that being our entry point. And that doesn't mean that we plan everything together. It means that at least the UN has a comprehensive view of what it needs to contribute to in a country. And so the cooperation framework and the CCA essentially is that tool. And I think it's kind of safe to say that we're all also beyond the development system as well, kind of coming together around that specific tool to look at how we can operationalize that. The second part of the cooperation framework is then a programming response to that analysis. So that's the actual the actual kind of planning element of that. So that programming response for us as the development actors is really looking at with the government agreeing on the right priorities, making sure that we've assigned the right roles to the UN development system, and also making sure that our plans are achievable. So thinking through more systematically with the government where we land in the context of their own development plans. And of course, the new cooperation framework for us also really repositions our work as a development system firmly around the SDGs. So it places a lot more importance on the analysis, on the economic dimensions of a task at hand, on risk, on the UN's demonstrated value, which speaks to some of the things that I think Rania was also talking about early on. And we also hope that the cooperation framework will really kind of help also mobilize, achieve the financing for the SDGs. And of course, in transition context, that also means looking at how do we finance a transition, which is something that the PBF, and I hope Leslie will also talk about in the context of Liberia. So this really matters for us because of what I said, which is the premium on the analysis. And also for us from the development system, I think we see that we'll be transitioning, no pun intended, to a much more policy advisory kind of development role, which of course, requires that we have better joint analysis from the start. So that's I think the second kind of point. So making sure that we, in these transition contexts, are analyzing jointly from the start and planning jointly from the start, and we kind of have the tools now to do that. The third point, I don't know how much time I have. 2-3 minutes. The third point would be really thinking through what a programmatic response in a transition context looks like. So we talk a lot about the drawdown and the closure of a mission and everything that has to do with that in terms of the logistics, in terms of the capability. What happens when, for example, the UN mission-mandated flight systems go down, who's going to be doing the logistics in a country. But actually the biggest thing is, for us from the development system, is really how are we making sure that we have a very clear programmatic transition. And this is also where the UN development system has a lot to offer, and through the cooperation framework and our joint plan from day one, hopefully we can also move some of those pieces along. Then the last piece I would maybe just highlight is the kind of new empowered role of the RC, HC, DSRSG in these missions. And from kind of 1st of January, of course, we, all 129 RCs, including the DSRSGs, transitioned to the Secretariat. And for us, in some ways you can think of that in terms of a symbolic transition, but also for us that means that we are now part of the same structure and support system that the Secretariat of the Peace and Security side is as well. And that, for us, it matters. The RC system transition matters because we've essentially released kind of the most precious commodity of all, which is time. So for the RCs to invest, so a lot of the RCs used to, of course, they were responsible for UNDP management, which in some places occupied 50 to 60% of their time. With this delinking, essentially, the RCs have a lot more time to invest on development coordination and system leadership. And in transition contexts where we're talking a lot about strategy, where we're talking about the longer term investments that we need to do with the government towards the SDGs, this is a commodity essentially that the system didn't have previously. And I think that the kind of last thing I wanted to maybe just put on the table as well is that, in my own view, we've gone a long way in terms of coming together, I think, as the UN community across the different technical pillars, I'll put it that way, in working on some of these transition contexts. It will be interesting to see, and maybe this is again a question to, I'm looking at Gunnar now, but also to other colleagues in the audience, to see how do we start talking about some of these issues in the context of the Security Council and then also the ECOSOC. So for the development system, a lot of our reporting and accountability is, of course, to ECOSOC, and looking at it from a technical perspective, I think sometimes also bridging the conversations around peace and development in some of these governance organs is very important. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks a lot, Taya. I really think, building on the last point you said, how do we really align these substantive visions, anchor it, and do it in a way where the UN's reconfiguring in the simultaneous process really matters a lot. And now I'd like to turn to my colleague on the left, Miss Leslie Connolly from the Life and Peace Institute, where she is a global peacebuilding policy advisor. Leslie is a co-author on 2 of the IPI publications, Transitions, and a former good partner in all of this. And Leslie, we really hope to hear how she'll carry the transitions example through the case study of UNMIL in Liberia, both from the peacekeeping side, but also from really the sustaining peace side.
Great, thank you, Daniel. And thank you for having me here today. I think it's great to be able to share and reflect on the Transitions project, which Daniel and I worked on for quite a long time. And as he mentioned, what I'm really going to try and do today is bring some of the Liberia case study to the table and really bring some examples that touch on what the points that have been raised before. And we looked at Liberia for a period of 8 months, looking at it from the UNMIL transition to the UN country team, as well as the implementation of some of the UN development system reforms and the de-linking of the RC and the RR. And I think that whilst Liberia is praised very much as a success story, and it should be, there are a lot of elements we can take forward, and whilst there are a lot of elements that can be improved upon as well for the future transitions. So in my few minutes up here, I'm just going to highlight 4 main points, which are some of the innovations that we really took away that could be applied to some of the future contexts. The first one I wanted to touch on is looking at this phased and sequenced approach to a transition. In the case of Liberia, what we saw was a phased and sequenced approach in that we had a military transition, which ended in 2016, which was then followed by a civilian transition and reconfiguration, which lasted until the end of the mission in March of 2018. The challenge, however, was that disproportionate amounts of attention were focused on the military components versus that of the civilian component. If you look at the Security Council resolutions and the analysis that came out during that time period, there's a lot of focus on issues related to security, military reconfiguration, troop withdrawal, security-oriented tasks like security sector reform. But conversely, the same documents didn't really examine the civilian components, things like integrated planning, identification of these peacebuilding priorities in very much detail. The civilian component of the transition actually only came to the forefront once the security transition was finalized and a date for the final withdrawal of UNMIL was set. So what ended up happening was a mass acceleration of civilian transitions and the civilian aspects in about 14 months, as compared to almost 6 years, which was dedicated to the security component. In saying this, there really are 2 elements from the civilian component that are worth highlighting. One of them would be the Peacebuilding Plan, which I'm sure within this room we've heard a lot about. The Peacebuilding Plan was the first comprehensive peacebuilding planning framework mandated by the Council for transition. It broadly highlighted the unaddressed causes of conflict and helped to really create this shared and coherent picture to identify the priorities for the transitional phase. The challenge with the plan was that whilst very innovative, it had a very short time frame of about 90 days, and there was confusion at first with the Liberian government over the intention around the plan and who the real target was. Following the plan, we then saw the UNCT's capacity mapping, which really juxtaposed the 18 agency funds and programs capacities with the priorities identified in the plan. And it really helped to expose the significant programmatic, financial, personnel, and operational investments that would be required to sustain the UN's engagement in Liberia. While both processes have been praised as innovative, in an ideal world, you would have the mapping and the plan done before the date has been set for the exit. And this would be done in a very sort of close and collaborated approach with national actors. By using this time frame, you would be able to have a clearer picture of what resources are really needed, what the priorities are, what type of follow-on configuration would be best suited for the context, as well as be able to understand some of the dynamics at play in the local context. And this really connects to the second point that we have on how the external changes in the country really need to connect to and impact on the UN's transition plan. And I think that Rania and Taya have touched on this quite a bit. But in Liberia, we saw not just a double transition, but a triple transition. We had the UN reconfiguring from the peacekeeping mission to the UN country team. And very shortly after, we saw the development system reforms and the de-linking of the RC and the RR, a new structure with the Empowered Resident Coordinator's Office, which added a further level of transition within the UN system, and I think a bit of risk and challenge in terms of what it meant to sort of conceptualize the UN's role under this continually changing environment. But added to that, you also had a country that was going through an election and a change in leadership, with the country's first post-conflict democratic transition taking place just months before the withdrawal. So Rania really touched on this entire too about the role of elections as a benchmark. And the reality is that in a case like Liberia, there was a huge added element of uncertainty, a period of time to build up relationships and reconceptualize and replan what an integrated UN and Liberian government approach would be. So the consideration of elements such as elections really do need to come into the planning for the transition. The third element we touched on in our papers really looked at the post-UNMIL, post-transition reconfiguration of the UN. In Liberia, as has been touched on, it was one of the earliest cases of the UN development system reform. So we had an empowered resident coordinator's office, de-linked RR and RC role, the next generation UN country team, and a lot of these elements and innovations that came with these reforms we did see in the country team. A lot of the joint analysis, planning, and programming has been taking place. The integrated approach to risk analysis and risk assessment, which I think is very relevant to and very much in line with the sustaining peace approach and the development system reforms. There's been a concerted effort to try and align the UNDAF, or the Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, with Liberia's National Development Plan, and a much closer collaboration with civil society organizations and regional and sub-regional actors. So a lot of these innovations we did see taking place on the ground, but in saying that, there is, within a transition, UNDP is often disproportionately disadvantaged during the transition. They bear a lot of the burden, considering they're the largest both financial and staff capacity operational entity on the ground. In the case of Liberia, UNDP did recognize this role and made efforts to prepare, doing its own capacity mapping following the UNCT's capacity mapping, but still struggled to really adapt and mobilize the resources necessary to take on a lot of the peacebuilding related tasks in a post-UNMIL setting. And this also touches on a broader issue of whether and to what degree peacekeeping operations are set up to address peacebuilding priorities, and how many of these priorities are left over once the mission leaves. The last point I wanted to touch on was this notion of the sustained attention. As Rania mentioned, there's a need to really sustain attention. Transitions are not once-off elements. They don't just end when the mission withdraws. And as Taya mentioned, there are many forums within the UN entity to focus on transition. The one that we saw playing a significant role with Liberia was the Peacebuilding Commission. Since 2010, when Liberia joined the PBC's agenda, and under Sweden's leadership as chair of the country-specific configuration, the PBC was able to play a majorly supportive role for the Liberia process, from looking at and accompanying the Peacebuilding Plan, looking at the UNMIL transition and elections preparation, and in a post-transition setting in terms of the National Development Plan, and highlighting the financial needs that the country and the UN country team has right now. With Sweden on the council during the last few months of the UNMIL transition, this played an added role where there was coherent sharing of analysis and a bridge between the PBC and the Security Council, which we saw offering a large degree of sort of integrated planning and analysis from these two bodies. But as Taya said, the PBC is not the only body. The ECOSOC can play a role, as can the Group of Friends on Sustaining Peace, and trying to target different actors to look at the transition issue. So whilst very brief, I just wanted to highlight some of these main points that we saw from the Liberian context, and really just reiterate that our big takeaways from a lot of the work we've done on the topic is that transitions are multi-year processes that require sustained political, security, and programmatic engagement from the entire UN system, both in the field and in headquarters. The transitions need to be driven by the analysis on the ground, rooted in the realities and the capacities and political dynamics at play. And sufficient attention needs to be given to the post-transition configuration to really unpack what type of financial and substantive needs are necessary to be able to sustain the long-term peace within the Liberian context. Moving forward, there is a lot that can be taken from Liberia, but also knowing that some of the transitions that are being faced coming up with Darfur, with Haiti, are much more complex, and there are a lot more dynamics at play. So I'm happy to share more from our research and the question and answers, but just wanted to share these points.
Thanks so much, Leslie. Last but not least, we have Mr. Gunnar Birkemeyer, Peacekeeping Coordinator at the Permanent Mission of Germany to the UN. We've heard a lot about the role of politics and the centrality of them to transitions, and now we have the privilege of hearing from a council member who deals with these questions on a daily basis. Gunnar, please go ahead.
Thank you, Daniel, and good afternoon. And as Daniel said, transitions maybe is one of the key themes during Germany's 2 years term on the council. And being Germans, we of course prepared very long in advance to being on the council, looked at the agenda, and saw of course that Haiti is coming up, Guinea-Bissau is in transition. We have the starting transition in MONUSCO. And we also thought that it would be good. We looked at UNAMID, and where we now co-panhold together with the Brits at a time when we felt Sudan maybe needed more attention from the council. Things have shifted now. But this is the way we looked at the agenda for the next couple of years during our time on the council. And I thought, also prompted by Raya and Taya and now Daniel, maybe it would be useful if I shared some of the insights after the first 9 months on the council and how this works, and from our council member perspective. And I think the key theme really is it's inherently political. And maybe I'd like to unpack how this political nature of transitions plays out from a member state's perspective. So to share some observations, some experiences, some of our initiatives, but also maybe some of the absurdities that we've encountered when working on transitions in a very political context. So first, Oregon obviously is the Security Council. And I think the first takeaway when coming as a non-permanent member to the council is that many things have a very, very long process that is already started. If you look at the mandate for Mali, for MINUSMA, for example, already now we are talking about initiating a transition plan. In my experience, at least in 2 cases, this is juxtaposed with the inherent need to be flexible. And I think the first case in point is Congo and MONUSCO, where I think the majority of the council thought we are in a clear drawdown situation. We are moving towards transition, and the elections happened, and everybody knows that this is not the result that most of the observers expected. So I think there we can really see the need for the council to adapt and to move away from a preset course that looks into transitions, maybe take a pause as we did with Congo. So I think that's the first really key takeaway from me. Even if you have long-term processes, you need to be flexible, and you need to have the council be willing to adjust to this situation. I think the more obvious case in point is Sudan and Darfur. Together with the UK, we thought we needed the council to take a pause during a very difficult moment in Khartoum. And it's also not a secret that we had difficult discussions in the council to what degree political developments in the capital do affect a peacekeeping mission that has a mandate for a specific part of the country. And I think there the council has made a good effort in coming together and agreeing on a reasonable course that would not, in the middle of political turmoil, set the course for mission drawdown and closure. But these conversations are very difficult ones. And I think this we have to realize that this is 15 council members in different configuration with different interests and different viewpoints have to come together and decide on a somewhat rational process that will make it possible for the UN system to actually also deliver against the council directions. And I think in these 2 cases, but also more broadly on Haiti, what we as Germany tried to do really is to help shift the conversation a bit away from how do we get out, how do we get quickly a decision in the council that peacekeeping is stopped, is ended, into a conversation that would more revolve around how do we get out in a sustainable manner. And I think this is really our responsibility when writing mandates, when putting, for example, in the MONUSCO mandate, a clear request to the Secretariat to come up with a transition strategy that really addresses the needs. So this is something that we'd like to continue to work on. Part of this also is to recognize that transitions are also discussion about how long a country will be on the agenda of the Security Council. And we can talk about the role of the RCs. We can think about designing a special political mission. We can do this in a very smart, integrated manner. But essentially, in some cases, we'll have to face the reality that it will be a question as to whether a majority of the council, or at least a group of members, is willing to see this country go from the agenda of the Security Council. Not immediately, of course. We know there's a longer period that this agenda item formally stays on it, but I think recognizing that this is part of the conversations, and it's not a only rational design what comes next. This is something that I personally have learned, and I think that we have to link with the technical expertise of the Secretariat, with the ideas of the other council members, to come up with a solid and responsible solution that not only looks at politics, but recognizes that we look at politics. Maybe a final point in terms of Security Council dynamics on benchmarks. My experience really is that benchmarks will never give you the answer. They will never give you the answer whether it's actually good or bad to withdraw a peacekeeping mission. It will only be a negotiated text that would, in most cases, be able to be read in very different manners. The Secretariat will, for understandable reasons, never give the Council a very clear assessment. So in the end, it will be a political decision and political discussion. I think by recognizing this, we take away a bit of the pressure that this is actually a tool to deliver a clear answer, but really just a stepping stone to engage in a conversation that is ideally best on a solid and clear analysis. But we cannot substitute this political discussion in the Council with the benchmarks setup or with analysis of the benchmarks. Maybe, because Leslie, you also mentioned it, the second arena where we as Germany think it's important to engage on transitions is the Peacebuilding Commission. And we spoke about Leslie spoke about the example of Liberia. My feeling is that the days of country-specific configurations of the Peacebuilding Commissions are maybe not over, but at least it's not that we see a great proliferation of those. So I think we have to, as member states, really think about how we use the Commission in a way that makes sense. And from our perspective, it doesn't make sense to just say, okay, it's a transition country, let's have the Peacebuilding Commission meet once, come up with something, and this is a good indicator for work in an integrated manner. The way we look at it as Germany is that the Peacebuilding Commission can really be an added value if we, as member states in the Peacebuilding Commission, are able to formulate concrete, specific advice to the Security Council that the Security Council could take up in the mandating process. And I think there was a very good example by the Moroccan chair of the country configuration on CAR, where really out of his visit to the country, there was a development of clear recommendations to the Council. I think these kind of tools really make sense to interact between Commission and Council and not have it as a standard item only. I think in this connection, it's also very important to look at the Peacebuilding Fund. For Germany, it's a very important tool. We are, at the moment, I think, the biggest funder. But also, we have to recognize that this cannot be the only tool. So I think we have to resist this reflex to say, okay, if we are in the transition context, let's have the Peacebuilding Commission deal with it, or let's have the PBF funded. I mean, there's, I think, some 30 million in this transition window for the Peacebuilding Fund, which is a dedicated part of the fund to deal with transitions. This is positive, but this will never suffice. If you look at the needs in Darfur, the Peacebuilding Fund can only be a catalytic initial funding. So I think we as member states also have to be realistic with what we demand from the UN system. And maybe ending on a third point and on a third arena where we have to politically fight for transitions, and that's the Fifth Committee. And I think maybe this is even, I should have mentioned it first, because of course a lot of pressure on the peacekeeping missions and on the time schedule comes from the Fifth Committee. And I think there we really have to be careful. I think Germany funds around 6% out of the assessed budget. So institutionally, if we talk to Berlin, to our finance ministry, there is a bit of interest in closing missions, and that makes sense. But I think from our perspective, really, transitions are not the time to be stingy. And so this we also have to fight in the Fifth Committee. And I think there are some interesting developments. Of course, there's general pressure on the budget. Of course, there's interest in closing the missions. But I think there's also a couple of good points that we've seen in the Fifth Committee recently. And maybe just to mention one point on UNAMID, there was the decision to give the mission programmatic funding so that it could bridge the obvious peace-building needs. And we just came back from a joint trip between the UK and Germany from West Darfur, where we've seen this programmatic funding in action, having the peacekeeping mission supporting with assessed and programmatic funding the work of the country team. This cannot go on forever, that's very clear, but I think in terms of measures that would be used in such a critical transition time where we actually know that we are facing a funding gap and institutionally we're not very well prepared, I think these stopgap measures are very interesting. And I think collectively as member states, we have to look into synchronizing our work on the Council, in the Peacebuilding Commission, and then also finally in the Fifth Committee. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Gunnar. I feel like the four panelists here, there's been a lot of alignment between the big picture takeaways, both from sustainability of transitions, from the need to do diverse reconfiguration at both the headquarters and field level, and the role of member states and the UN system coming together. So now we have time for about one or two rounds of questions. I would kindly ask you to please raise your hand. I have colleagues who are available on the sides of the room who will bring a microphone. We'll take 3 or 4 questions from the floor, and please identify yourself and tell us your affiliation when you start.
Thank you so much, moderator, and I would like to thank the speakers also. My name is Husni Mustafa, I'm from Sudan Mission. I would like to thank the speakers for their presentations. It is informative, comprehensive, and useful. I have a few questions. The first one, regarding the ownership and the leadership of the transition or the post-transition period. We see the reconfiguration of the UN that met levels of cooperation between the departments more than before. We saw in Sudan recently a very good visioning exercise between all entities of the UN, and that I think from the experience that mentioned by the speakers, that taken from Liberia. After that exercise and the experiences in Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and maybe in Haiti, what do you think that the lessons that learned from the previous experiences can be done in the forthcoming transition or ongoing transition in Sudan now? By the end of 2020, we will see not triple transition in Sudan, but also quartet, because it is a transition from peacekeeping to peace building in Darfur, from peace to from war to peace in Blue Nile and South Kordofan, as well as from autocracy to democracy in Khartoum, and maybe from isolation to openness with the international community globally. So this is multifaceted transition and very complicated. How could the UN harness the resources to help Sudan overcome this very critical and very sensitive transition in the history of the country? I commend the visit of the Foreign Minister of Germany to Sudan as the first foreign minister to visit Sudan after the civilian-led government took over. And also your field mission, I appreciate it. Germany and UK was leading these efforts. And now also I get a point from your speech, Gunnar, that the benchmarks cannot give answers for the questions of how did you reach this result? As far as I know previously, like recently, in the Security Council, Germany was stressing the issue of benchmarks regarding UNAMID itself. So also we have an obstacle to take the country from economic troubles to economic transformation and growth, but there is still impediments. That is a legacy of the previous regime regarding the list of the states sponsoring terrorism. Now there's a big political change, but we need the international community assistance on that. How could the UN push on that way to lift Sudan from that list of states sponsoring terrorism? Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I know we have another question here.
My name is Emanuela Calabrini, and I'm working in the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. I wanted to build a little bit on what our colleague from DCO was mentioning about breaking the silos between the various intergovernmental bodies, particularly the Security Council and ECOSOC. Also taking advantage of the presence of our colleague from the German mission, looking at, for instance, the mandate of the Special Political Mission in Haiti, to what extent the Security Council took into account the view of the ad hoc advisory group on Haiti from the ECOSOC that provided an informal briefing to the Security Council after its mission to Haiti in May, in which basically mentioned the importance of having more of a coherent and integrated approach between the SPM, the BINU, and the UN country team, and whether this type of informal briefing from an ECOSOC body to the Security Council could be of help to the Security Council. What is important from having now worked on the ECOSOC and continue to work on ECOSOC is that the charter of the UN in Article 65 provides for this interaction between ECOSOC and Security Council, but this article has only been used 2 times since the charter was adopted. So again, there is scope for more interaction, but in what ways and what ideas can be pursued for this interaction to be more systematic? Thank you.
All right, one question to my left. Thank you.
Hi, Wasim Mir from the UN Foundation. So thank you very much for IPI and all the panel speakers. It's been really interesting. Can you hear me? Hear me now? Okay, I'll speak closer and slower. That'll probably help. Wasim Mir from the UN Foundation. So firstly, thank you very much for IPI for organizing the event and for doing all this important research and for all the speakers. I think it's along the lines of the last question. I just want to build on that. And it's particularly perhaps focused on our German colleague. We've spoken a lot about the crucial decision-making that has to be taken, particularly in the Council, but also perhaps the role that ECOSOC might play, PBC, and even the Fifth Committee of the General Assembly. Some of that involves political considerations, but some of it also involves judgment calls on the part of members of the intergovernmental bodies. So coming kind of new to the Council as a non-permanent member, what kind of information, what kind of exposure has made you confident that you're able to make the right kind of judgments in these situations? And how can we be getting members of the members of different intergovernmental organs ready and prepared to better make decisions around transition?
Thank you, Wasim. So we have 3 rich sets of questions, so maybe I'll turn back to the panelists. Maybe we'll start with Rania first, or would you like me to go in reverse order? Sure, and maybe since there are a few specific questions directed at Gunnar, maybe you can start with those and then we'll move this way.
Thank you, Daniel. Maybe also starting in reverse order in terms of questions. So the last one was around what made us feel that we are able to exercise some judgment in the council. So I'd say there are at least four elements. Specifically on transitions, of course, for us it's important to look at precedents, to look at experience, and I think the IPI research helped us to situate those discussions in the historical and recent context. So first one, independent research. I think the second one is field visits from New York. In my experience, that makes a lot of sense. The third element is, of course, input by the Secretariat, be it formal or informal. And I think we've seen some effort by the Secretariat in being less narrative in reports and being more strategic. This is something that we continue to express as a hope to the Secretariat, that we have less of this happened then and then the next thing happened, but being more strategic. And I think for Germany, I can say that, of course, for us it's very, very important to have our missions in the various countries being completely not only up to speed, but being a force multiplier, a source of information for us here in New York. So these are the four elements I'd see that makes it possible, I think, for us to engage in these political conversations. The second question around ECOWAS participation advice. I haven't followed the Haiti example myself. What I heard from my colleague who was leading on these negotiations, that she appreciated the input. I think for me, the same that I mentioned about the Peacebuilding Commission holds true. Generically, maybe there is no generic answer to this, but if there is specific tailored advice, I think this makes a lot of sense. But just linking institutions and having general discussions, I'm a bit hesitant that this would provide an added value. And actually, it's also a question of resources and timing. We have to be conscious of the fact that there's only so much information and additional institutional linkage that negotiators in the council can cope with. But if it's tailored, if it's specific, I think it could continue to provide added value. And the case of Haiti is certainly one where the linkage is obvious and clear, and maybe that's a good starting point. On the third question from the colleague from Sudan, I think it's very clear that, at least from the perspective of co-pen holders on the UNAMID file, it's precisely this conversation, this shifting conversation with Sudan, that is very important, and very important to listen also what comes out of the country. And I think there's a very fruitful process of engaging, be it with the UN system or be it with the council that has started recently. On the benchmarks, I think my point was that they will not give us the clear decision is the rule of law in Darfur exactly on that level that we can withdraw UNAMID without waking up at night thinking this is a bad decision. But it will be a judgment call, and I think we have to treat it as that. And so in that sense, benchmarks are entirely important, and they're very important as stepping stones. But I think we shouldn't fall into this trap of thinking once we have negotiated as council members benchmarks, 6 months down the road, we can just compare facts and say, okay, clearly these benchmarks have not been met. They're not designed in that way because there's often, in many cases, and it was also the case for UNAMID, there is no consensus what these benchmarks should do. And maybe read it as a tool to say it's good to withdraw UNAMID, and others thought it would be important to reach a certain level before UNAMID can be withdrawn. And so I think we have to deal with it as a part of a political negotiation and not a technical exercise. When recognizing this, I think we're already one step ahead. Thank you.
I think just to complement what Gunnar said about the Sudan case is that even listening to this panel, you can hear that a lot of the challenges that we saw in the Liberia case are being dealt with, that a lot of the innovations are taking place, and a lot of the processes that we see now around transition, the discussions have progressed so much. The fact that there is the use of programmatic funding as a bridge is a huge innovation to really try and relieve the financial pressure. The fact that there is a lot of flexibility on the timelines around the transition and recognition of the complexity shows a level of progress in terms of analyzing the situation. So I know that Daniel can say a lot more, who is actually doing research on the preparations for the UNAMID transitions, but to just say, I think that we are seeing a lot of progress in the way that the UN system is handling transitions.
Well, I think Leslie kind of covered parts of what I was going to say in the context of Sudan. Well, first of all, I actually think that the fact that we're having this conversation is already progress in that, you know, I think even 3 or 4 years ago, we weren't really talking across whether it was the Council and ECOSOC or whether it was the different parts of the UN system of comprehensively having a vision, a support vision for the government, essentially. And I think what you've said in terms of the Sudan visioning exercise, you know, to me shows already that we've moved and we've learned from some of these other cases. Of course, from the development perspective, our whole planning process and support process is towards the government's development priorities. So part of, you know, I assume, and, you know, our resident coordinator on the ground, who I'm sure you know very well, part of that process is now identifying the support needs for the peace building side of that, and across these various transitions. So that's maybe a roundabout answer, but I feel like you kind of covered some of those already. I wanted to quickly just comment on the question that the colleague from DESA said, even though it wasn't maybe targeted at me specifically. But I think my comment on the relationship between ECOSOC and the Security Council was more around, someone said, was it Leslie, you said that these transitions are multi-year efforts, which means that, you know, we start from a point where we know that a drawdown is happening, and then we build from that into something that, you know, into a longer term plan that supports the country and the populations achieve their SDGs. And I think the dialogue aspect to me is not so much an organizational dialogue as it is even an informal dialogue around, do we all know what's at stake in these transition contexts? Are we looking at the best possible modalities around financing of the UN system to make sure that we're all pulling towards the same goals? It's, you know, those are the kind of conversations that I would think need to happen, and I certainly don't see happening yet. Maybe here and there in these informal today in this panel, but I think we need to become more systemic. Ultimately, it's also about how the member states push the UN system as a whole to be effective in these contexts, and I think that a big part of that is really also thinking through some of these issues. Thanks.
All right. I really like the question on the national ownership, Hosni, and I think it's not just about Sudan. I think it applies to every country in which we transition. And where you are right is, I think, until recently, we used to do our planning and thinking without necessarily linking into the national governments and their planning and their thinking. And there is absolutely a clarity and a recognition and a lesson that's been learned, as I said earlier, that everything we do has to be anchored on the vision of the country and on the strategic direction and plan of the country. Because otherwise, it's not sustainable and it's a bit pointless. In the new phase of the transitions project, what is new from what we did before in terms of sending experts and to our own missions and our own teams is that we intend to work to send transition experts to work with host governments and countries so that their capacity to plan transitions with us is enhanced. Their ability to define and develop their own plans is also enhanced. And I think that is your answer. It's a recognition that we do not move without the host nation's nod or direction, in a sense. So that's an important lesson. In response to your question about what we've learned, I think I narrated on a few of those, but certainly we have to watch out for losing the international interest in a country when it's in transition. We have to watch out for the loss of the finances that support that. We have to watch out for, and specifically in Sudan, all the work that's been done on gender, women, peace and security, that isn't lost either as we move into the new phase of whatever the country is going to build and is trying to build. And I think we have to watch out that also our governance and conflict resolution systems are in place so we don't relapse into conflict. So there's a lot of lessons learned out there that I think can help guide much of this discussion and endeavors for future. And I learned today from our ECOSOC, from our DESA colleague about only twice using this article. I now will look it up, actually. But I welcome any and all bodies coming together. If ECOSOC wishes to advise the Council, hallelujah. You know, it will provide some level of guidance. If the Commission wants to come in and do the same, hallelujah. I think it brings a certain level of strategic coherence that we've been thriving for a very long time. And it's really great that transitions are becoming the conduit where a lot of this is, the threads are kind of pulling together. I think it's very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We have time for another quick round of questions if more colleagues from the floor would like to make some remarks. Oh, we have one question there. I'm sorry. Please go ahead. No, behind you.
Oh, sorry. Thanks. Joanna Meyer. Thank you, IPI, always, and thank you, everyone here. I saw earlier today that the new U.S. ambassador to the UN, Kelly Craft, will be going to Sudan. I'm not quite sure how to phrase this question, but on my desktop, I keep a little graph of all the countries in Africa that the U.S. government, or that the U.S. presidents have visited, and there's just a few. And so I'm wondering what we can say here today about the expectation of the current of what Trump might have to interject into the conversation of Sudan if we're sending Kelly Craft, and then if you can throw in any sprinkling of climate-related anything, I would welcome that. Thank you.
Any other questions before we turn back to the panel? No? Anyone ready to jump into that? I mean, maybe I'll just say that I think U.S. engagement constructively on the file is really important, and I think it's, I don't want to prejudge what the U.S. position would be, but I think we've seen that having all 15 council members around, getting as much firsthand information as possible, hearing directly from national authorities and different actors across the spectrum in Sudan will ultimately contribute to richer discussions within the council and to a more informed process. And, we recognize, and we heard from the Sudanese colleague as well, there's the issue about Sudan on the list of designated state sponsors of terrorism. And, the more firsthand information that can inform the government processes and ultimately contribute to the UN's overall inclusive approach to the Sudanese transition and to the UNAMID transition is really valuable. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues here for a really rich discussion. Thank you to Germany once again for the sustained partnership on this project. And thanks to all of you for taking the time out of your day to join us. Have a great afternoon.